Starting from Earth, stealing RPG ideas from real-world folklore and the occult, with Steve and Paula Dempsey, Dragon Meet 2021.
Welcome to our panel on using the real-world folklore, is there such a thing, the real-world folklore, and the occult to enliven your role-playing games. This is Steve, I'm Paula, he's a gamer, I'm a folklorist, together we fight crime. And the subject of this talk, we're going to work through, first of all, Steve's going to talk about all the mechanical stuff, then we're going to talk about some real-life folklore, and how you can adapt it and make your games extra weird and extra creepy. So over to Steve.
Right, hello. So we're going to start with an occult symbol to start with. And this is how I use the real world in games. So there are three sort of elements to this. The first one is the principles, where I find a thread in the real world and I tug it, which essentially means just looking for all the consequences of what that real world thing is. I aim for obscurity, so I try and use something nobody's used before, although most of the time I just look on Wikipedia. I aim for completism, which if you're on Wikipedia, you just keep following links. It's lovely. You go down a rabbit hole, you find all kinds of interesting stuff. It's automatically linked, so you can put that in your game straight away. Sheer madness. You know, if it looks too good to be true, then it's definitely going in. And the other thing I do sometimes is working backwards. You start from the thing you want to achieve, and then you look for things in the real world that will fill in with that. And the reason why you're using real world stuff is that everybody relates to it more easily. There's already a story there. It already makes sense in some kind of weird way. So then I would take these weird elements and combine them with the real world stuff. And I use three principles there. So the first one is correlation, so looking for links, however tenuous. And we'll come to examples later on. This is just the principles at the moment. Something I call pivots, which is things that you can change. So sometimes the real world doesn't quite fit your game, or the game doesn't quite fit the real world, so change them. It doesn't really matter. If there's a thing that says it happened in the 12th century, you would need it to be the 11th century. That's fine. Nobody else is going to notice unless they're a historian. Okay, you'll notice. And layers. The other thing is layers on combining events. Don't just present the whole truth in one go. Have lots of layers of truth, like the classic Call of Cthulhu onion peel. You peel away a layer, you find another truth behind it. You keep peeling away layers and you find out what's going on. And the other thing you can't forget is motivations. So what are the motivations for the players? So you've got a theme for your game, whether it's Call of Cthulhu or liminal, or you might just be folklore hunters looking for shanties. Stick to that theme and keep everything you bring into your game meet that theme. Noir is quite a good hook because essentially it means there's ambiguity. So if you can get cynicism, moral ambiguity, difficult questions for people to answer, particularly the players, then that's another one to include. Cui bono is who benefits. You know, the weird thing that's going on, somebody is doing it for some benefit. So have in mind an end idea of why they're doing this thing. And the final thing here is the hook. Have something that forces the players to act. You know, there's something's going to go really badly unless they do something. Put that hook in there and drag them into the game. Right. So moving on from that.
Inspirations. Okay, so all of the lore that we present here is available in least in some format on Wikipedia and things, or books. We've got a bibliography at the end with some books that we really recommend, and some of the writers are mates, so give them some money. Steve has written here, Paula is a pop folklorist. Thank you. So I tend to know the names of stuff, like who wrote this about this in what year and whatever. And the books they've written, but Steve just likes disappearing down the rabbit hole, really, don't you?
Yes.
And we have many discussions about like how precious you can be about folklore and how much you can stretch it and pull it and stick it in a game, and even more about magic. But the important thing is, during all of this, you've learned about what folklore is. So, yay.
I have. I've been paying attention. So, folklore is essentially the stories that a group tells about themselves. It's also the practices that derive from those stories. So it could be how the kingdom and the tower shall fall if the ravens leave the Tower of London, which is quite well known to Londoners. It could be making corn dollies at harvest time, which are these weird things over here, slightly blurry things, which, I don't know, there's something to do with fertility and renewing the harvest and protecting the fields, stuff like that. I'm not an expert. It might be cheese rolling in Gloucestershire. So here's some idiots chasing a 40-pound cheese down a hill, which they do once a year in Gloucestershire when COVID isn't around. And it's not uncommon for people to break legs or arms or wrists. But you get a cheese at the end if you're first down the hill.
And we have to do it because, like, if we don't know what will happen.
Yeah, exactly. And you might even go as far as Slender Man, which is an internet folklore thing. So these stories are important because they're part of the shared culture. The stories have a beginning, but quite often it's sort of lost in the mist of times. And quite often they change over time as well. And many of the calendar customs that we have, which are folkloric things that happen on a particular day, such as this cheese rolling, have changed over the last 200 years. In fact, they were probably only invented in the last 200 years. The Victorians are responsible for a lot of them. And cultures are also permeable to influences from other cultures. So the quintessentially Morris dance is possibly of Moorish origins, hence the name Morris. And Punch and Judy, which you can see in the corner behind me, just about, is Italian in origin, but it's thought of as quintessentially British now. So folklore, if you use it, adds a dimension of believability to games because it shows you something about the culture in which the game is taking place, what has influenced the culture, and what people value. Sausages, I think.
Crocodiles. So we're going to work an example?
We are.
Right, this is brilliant. This is the Abbots Bromley horn dance. So Abbots Bromley is a small village, and these horns that these men are carrying, they are reindeer horns. The custom definitely dates back as far as the 1600s, but there is in terms of the written record, but there's a very strong possibility that it's much older. The reindeer died out in Britain a long time ago. These horns have been carbon dated. They were carbon dated back in the 70s to the 11th century. It is possible that they were brought over by Vikings. Why the hell they have to be paraded through the village every September, we don't know. That you'll usually get two answers. Either it's good luck or, well, we don't know, we just do it. We don't know, we just do it is by far the most common, but it's the fourth Sunday in September every year, COVID permitting. 6 men dance through the village of Abbots Bromley carrying these horns. They're kept in the church for the rest of the time. So anybody tells you it's pagan, dodgy. In fact, anybody tells you that any folk custom is pagan, dodgy. They are accompanied by far more common folkloric figures. So the sort of people you would see also hanging out with Morris sides. So you have the fool, the mummer, the hobby horse or obios that accompany them around. And they're much more common folklore figures, but these are unique to Abbots Bromley. And it has been suggested that this began as a kind of sympathetic magic. Do you want to encourage a good deer hunt? Good venison for the autumn? But, the answer is really, we just don't know. We do know that the villagers are extremely anxious that this is carried out. It's been cancelled, as far as we're aware, twice ever since recorded records, yeah. But since records began. There was a cancellation back in the 30s or 20s? 1920s, yeah. because quite close to the event, one of the musicians was taken very ill and one of the dancers died. The only other cancellation was last year due to COVID. So that is 2 cancellations in about 400 years. But what is fun to play with, to a certain extent, is, first of all, why do they do this weird thing? And also, what about these cancellations? Over to you.
Right, so taking this idea, obscurity, the horn dance isn't very well known outside of folklore circles or Abbots Bromley. The horns have been carbon dated to the 11th century, and performers became ill and died in the 1920s. Now, this sounds like quite creepy. So who benefits? What's the dance for? It might be to do with fertility for reindeer, for the hunt, but that's not going to kill people, is it? So maybe there's something a bit more darker. So these guys are wearing horns, so I looked for horned gods. And what you find is you see this guy on the top right here, or left. So this is Kerninos. This is from the Galderstrup Cauldron, which was in the British Museum for a bit, but usually lives in Denmark. And he's an early Iron Age. This is an early Iron Age silver cauldron, but he's Danish, really. He's not English, and it's a bit difficult to relate him to what's happening in Abbots Bromley. So I looked a bit further and found the Wild Hunt, where a huntsman and a load of hounds hunt through the night, tearing down people and being horrible. It's a folklore motif that's common across Europe, but we have a particular English one who I didn't know about until yesterday, called King Hurler. And King Hurler was king of the Britons, and he visited a fairy. He had a fairy come to his wedding, bring loads of presents. He had to go to the fairy wedding so as not to upset the fairies. The dwarf, who essentially an earth spirit in English, who was at this ferry, gave him a present of a dog and said, "Don't get off your horse before the dog gets down." So he rode back to his land. Some of his men got off their horse and they turned to dust, because he then talked to a woman who was standing nearby, and she said, "How come you're a Briton? We're all Anglo-Saxons. I don't really understand how you're talking." It had been 120 years since he'd been to the ferry wedding, and if he got off his horse, he would die. So he's stuck on his horse, wandering around the forests of South Warwickshire, I think it is, roughly, Abbots Bromley. So the legend of Hurler says that he finally disappeared in the reign of Henry II, which is around the 12th century. But I'm going to shift that to William II, which is around the 11th century, so it matches the date at which the people at the horn dance, when the horn dance started, essentially. So the horn dance, the idea here now is that the horn dance stops Hurler from ravaging throughout the land with his hunt. And if he catches you, you have to get on one of the spare horses with him and ride with him, and you can then never get off the horse because you'll just turn to dust and die. I suppose after a while you might want to do that, but you might miss some of your friends and family. So now we've got a reason that the hunt is being taken forward, and now we've got a reason that the horn dance is done. And 1920s, there's records. People will talk about it in the pubs. We'll set this, more modern day. If you talk to somebody in the pub, they had a grandparent who was around at the time, and they'll tell you that people died after they didn't do the horn dance. You can find reports in newspapers and things like that. There's a historical record, essentially. And they weren't able to do the dance in 2020. And so now Hurler is abroad again. And it's your job to try and stop him, because if he doesn't, people are going to die. So that's one thing you can do with Abbots Bromley.
Need to go back one.
Oops, sorry.
That's it. I just love this picture.
So the last one was about a localized threat, which would take a couple of sessions to resolve. But what about if you wanted something more reaching, something that threatens the whole world, which you can use as a frame for an entire campaign?
Which brings us to the delightful Joanna Southcott. and the very strange Octavia, and this box. So going into the late 19th century, Joanna Southcott was a prophetess who had a small but very dedicated bunch of followers. She threatened, is threatened the right word? To give birth to the Messiah. She was the woman of Revelation who would give birth to Shiloh, which would take us into the last days, which would lead to the end of the world. Southcott died. It was slightly strange circumstances. She was in her early 60s at that point, and she had some kind of disease. We don't know what, but it caused her stomach to become very swollen, and she believed that she was in the last stages of pregnancy, was about to give birth to Shiloh, and died. Her followers thought she was going to come back. They kept the body ready for her to rise from the dead. But once it started to putrefy, the local authorities insisted it was buried because, health reasons. So that's Southcote's story in a nutshell. But she left behind her a box of prophecies. And I think anything to do with occult-related games, you're thinking, here, prophecies, we can do stuff with this. The box has been left in the care of an organisation called the Panacea Society. This still exists. They're based up in Bedfordshire. I understand that there are very few of them and they're very elderly, so I don't know how much longer they're going to exist for. But they were formed by a vicar's wife called Mabel Bartrop, who took the name of Octavia when she started to head what was effectively her own cult. And she said that she was the daughter of God. So effectively, she had some sort of soul relationship to Southcott. So she and 12 other members had to convince 24 Anglican bishops to open this box, because only when they opened this box, a great panacea would be released. And before the world ended, there would be no disease, no death, no war, no anything. Great. Okay. So obviously 24 Anglican bishops weren't keen. They were probably washing their hair that day or whatever. But the box was opened in 1927 by Harry Price, who is one of my favourite anti-heroes. And he was a psychical researcher working in and around London in that sort of before the Second World War. So Price did it with one bishop and a couple of mediums and found the following contents: a few trinkets, a lottery ticket, which obviously didn't win, and just sort of general odds and ends, really, a bus ticket, stuff. But of course, the Panacea Society said, well, that's because you got the wrong box. That's not the real box. You didn't get the bishops. It's not the real box. So at the moment, we have a box of stuff that may or may not be the real box, potentially a box of prophecies and a cure for all the ills of the world, and an actually quite vociferous Panacea Society. I remember as a kid seeing adverts in the Sunday papers for this, that the world will continue to be terrible until the bishops open Joanna Southcote's box. So this is pretty far-reaching. Over to Steve for how you can use this to make your games weird.
So the claim was that war, famine and pestilence will end when the box is opened, which actually sounds quite ominous to me. More a threat and a warning, perhaps, than a promise of cosy happy times. And which god is Mabel Bartrop's parent? It could be a millennial Jesus, but it could be something like a scheming Loki, the vengeful spirit of Offa of Mercia, an Anglo-Saxon king who happened to be buried in Bedford, which is the home of the Panacea Society. Or looking at other local folklore, I found there's a thing called Nell's Well in Bedford, which is an ancient holy well. So perhaps there's something dwelling in that well that's got into the water that affected Joanna Southcott and is now influencing Mabel Bartrop and her community, and wants to spread their message instead of the message that the kind of message of peace and understanding that Joanna Southcott thought she was spreading. So I'm not going to go into any detail about this, but it's definitely the kind of thing that you could use as a longer campaign, and have people drawn into trying to find out where this box is, what's in it. There are all different kinds of actors who might be involved, from the Panacea Society themselves, who sound like Cthulhu cultists to me, to a lot of other authorities, the Church of England, local history societies, and it might be that there are other boxes in other places in the world. If you want a world-spanning Master of the Nyarlathotep game, you can definitely go in that sort of direction. So, moving on from these societies
to the creatures of folklore. You can introduce this bit, then I'll talk about the Mowing Devil.
Okay, so the creatures of folklore are many and peculiar. Every strange thing half seen in the woods, every unexplained creak in a building, and every ghostly light seen in the graveyard can be explained by a creature of folklore. Be it the black dogs of East England, mostly harbingers of death, selkies, who are seals who can step out their skins and turn into people, and screaming skulls who can shout the house down if moved from a niche in the wall.
Mm-hmm. But now we're going to talk about the Mowing Devil and the Lincoln Imp. Okay, so the Mowing Devil's a great story. This is Hertfordshire, obviously. It looks to me like this demon is making a bath mat, but I think I'm probably wrong. So what happened was in Hertfordshire, in that sort of late Tudor period, it was quite common to employ itinerant farm workers to do your mowing because it's massively intensive. You've got to do it while the weather's right. So it makes sense to bring in labour, spend a couple of days doing it, get it all done, and then the guy moves on. So a farmer had a chap that was coming to do his mowing. The chap quoted him how much it was going to cost to do this work. And the farmer was not impressed at all, far too expensive. And a heated argument broke out. This was not a calm negotiation. And the farmer actually said, look, I'd sooner pay the devil to do this than get you to do it. So that night, strange lights were seen in one of the farmer's fields. And the following morning, a circle of beautifully mown, flattened hay was found, which was allegedly done by the devil, who had indeed rocked up and done the job. And you come across this story a fair bit if you're into crop circles. It's often told as an example of a very early crop circle story and why, they really are real, honest. They must be, because people weren't making them up 400 years ago. But it's a nice story. What are you going to do with him?
So the devil has been summoned by being mentioned. There's the well-known saying, speak of the devil, and it continues, and he's bound to appear, which was first seen in print in 1666.
At that time.
Now, the devil will want payment, and probably not money. Either some impossible service, such as ploughing the fields of hell, or, I don't know, a turnip as large as a house, or souls. He's always keen on those. So the devil makes a direct approach to the farmer, but is initially rebuffed. And not taking no for an answer, he tries to trick the farmer using various disguises. But there's always some tell when the devil appears in disguise. It might be the cloven hooves that you can see under the dress of this pretty woman. It might be a strange smell around a priest. Or it could be that the person looks perfectly all right, but when you see their shadow, it's got horns. So all these terrible things are happening around this farm. You're trying to sort it out. The devil also summons some imps, his servants, to torture and set fire to things. So
yeah, loving imps. So the devil occasionally likes to make mischief. The two things you need to know about the devil in folklore: he gets in the way of stuff. He breaks stuff up, he messes things up, he stops things happening, and he's incredibly thick. He's really, really, really easy to trick. And so many stories about the devil are about how humans trick the devil, fool the devil. There's a particularly good one about somebody that didn't, but that's for another day. So the devil decided that he wanted to make some trouble in Lincoln. Got a nice cathedral, very proud of it, let's send some imps down, let's send some trouble. So the devil said, okay, I'm going to send down 2 imps, go to Lincoln Cathedral, make as much mess as you can, trash the place, really wind people up. And if the bishop is having screaming out dabs by tea time, you've done a good job. So these 2 imps rock up and they start to cause mayhem. But the good people of Lincoln, they're good Christians. So they think, right, we're going to pray, get rid of these imps for us before they just destroy our cathedral. So God sent an angel. And the angel came down, and one imp had a bit more presence of mind and escaped out of a window and went off to cause more mayhem elsewhere, but at least he left the cathedral alone. The second one wasn't so lucky. It was slightly paying too much attention to what it was doing, didn't see the angel come, and got turned to stone. And it's still there. And that's a warning to other imps. Don't come in, don't interfere with this cathedral, because that's what's going to happen to you. You're going to get turned to stone. Lincoln actually, weirdly, are very proud of this defeat of the imps. They named their football team after this little guy. So he's actually became quite positive for the town in the long run, but not very positive for the imp, who's been up there for probably about 1,000 years now. Over to you.
So we've got the devil who summoned these imps, and the imps, as you can tell, are not very bright. So perhaps you might be able to trick them to go into a church, or you could persuade a local hermit or holy man to intervene and talk to the imps, or condemn them somehow. And the other thing about the devil is he can never resist a bet or a competition. And that's where people usually beat the devil, because you can find some way of cheating and getting one over the devil. So that's what I would do with that.
On to the occult.
Yep.
Okay.
So the occult. So what is it? It's literally that which is hidden, either by accident or on purpose. It means supernatural magical powers and phenomena, in that they are shrouded in mystery, either as to their origins or to how they work. And folklore often refers to the occult. In the same way that something strange in the sky is taken as an alien spacecraft nowadays, previously it might have been fairies or angels. And strange noises around the house might be a brownie doing a spot of tidying, best leave out a bowl of porridge for it, or grandfather's walking spirit looking for his lost treasure. Hopefully it's not something more mischievous like a boggart spoiling the milk, or worse still, an imp or a demon sent by a vindictive neighbour. Mostly the occult refers to magic and the uses of it, a set of practices or rituals that manipulate natural or supernatural beings or forces. One might use a ritual to make fishing more abundant. This could be just wearing a lucky hat or putting that special ingredient in the bait, or if you're an early modern Arab, it involves making a talisman of the kind of fish you want to catch. You do the ritual when Pisces is rising, Jupiter is in ascendant, and in the hour of Venus, so just after sunrise on a Friday. The next chance for us is December the 31st. Fix the talisman to a silver spike and place in a lead-sealed glass jug full of water, and put the lot in the bottom of the river where you wish the fish to congregate. So that's from the Picatrix, which is a Latin translation of an Arabic text written in and around the 11th century, probably in the Iberian Peninsula. So this illustrates the fun of historical magic. It's not about shouting Expelliarmus the loudest. It's about choosing the materials and times which correspond to the desired result. Jupiter is the sign of luck. Pisces is the one of fish. Fish are silvery, and like attracts like. That's why the fish go to the talisman. As above, so below is the byword hermetic magic. This comes from the great ancient sage Hermes Trismegistus, you can see here, thrice master, who apparently was around just after Moses, because the longer ago it was, the closer it is to God. And so the truer it is. And actually, the Corpus Hermeticum, which is his collection of writings, dates from around 300 BCE. And magic, it seems, mostly works by metaphor, whether it's applying a salve to the weapon which injured you to cure the wound, or using a bee to make something work more quickly because bees are industrious. And as with metaphor, the laws of magic work in many ways. You might use an opposite in a ritual because opposites complete each other, like night and day. You might use the same because a doll of a person is the same as that person. you might refer to other things, such as the fact that if a thing can go wrong, it will go wrong, or that 1,000,000 to 1 chances work 9 times out of 10. Any relationship you can draw between the magic being performed and the target of the magic increases its chance of working. And also, you shouldn't forget that you have to purify yourself as a magician beforehand, and you have to prepare the ritual site as well. So almost all Western magic of the Common Era is of this form. A wand might be employed to deliver fireballs, having had an elemental bound into it, but rarely does the power come directly from the magicians themselves. So how to turn this into a game where the focus is trying to find all the necessaries for the successful performance of a ritual? Perhaps we might turn here to one of the most famous magical workings of the last century, the Magical Battle of Britain. Also, 2 no prizes for guessing who this guy is.
You.
No, it's Scott Dorward doing Summon Fish.
Okay. Who's the guy on the right?
You're up.
I know I'm up, but I don't know who he is. Okay, so New Forest Coven and the Magical Battle of Britain. This is one of the areas where we occasionally have a difference of opinion, because this is really using real life people who just about existed within living memory within a game situation. But let me tell you about the New Forest Coven. They were based in the New Forest that may have been going as early as 1922, was certainly going by the time the war started in 1939. They began as a kind of attachment to a Rosicrucian group that had a theatre in Christchurch near Bournemouth. And they were joined in the 30s by a gentleman called Gerald Gardner, who you might have heard of. He was a rubber planter out in Singapore, but he retired back to England and founded the religion that became Wicca, and was initiated into a coven, allegedly, according to Gardner, at this New Forest Coven by a woman called Dafoe. So during World War II, Britain was an imminent danger of a German invasion. It was scary. We had the Battle of Britain, but we also had the Magical Battle of Britain. So Gardner and the coven, according to Gardner, carried out a ritual very near the coast to repel boarders. Now, being Wiccans, they did this skyclad, so they were naked. Now, this is actually important because of what happened afterwards. And effectively, they generated something called a cone of power. Now, if you're doing anything around magic, this is really useful. It's about people working as a group to generate a power thing, which you can effectively direct. So when I picture it, I kind of picture it almost as a thing, as a real cone that you can kind of throw at somebody. And they didn't just throw it at Hitler. And they built up this energy. You shall not come, you shall not come, you shall not cross the sea, you shall not come. And certainly as a result of this, in their view, that added to the military might of the nation and stopped a Nazi invasion. Now, the reason that I say everybody being naked is important is because as a result of this, we know that at least 1 or 2 of the members of the coven died. I mean, they were all quite elderly. I think Gardner might have been one of the youngest. And it's very, very, very cold in the autumn on the coast. So it's not surprising that people were taken ill, perhaps. But maybe there's more to it. Do you want me to talk a little bit about the whole kind of sacrifice for the land thing? Or
I don't know what that is.
Okay, so there's a story, and again, this tends to be quite common within the sort of magical tradition, that in Britain particularly, every so often somebody has to give up their life to keep the land going, and it's particularly associated with the British royal family. So William, I can't remember which number he was, William Rufus, died supposedly when his horse put its foot in a molehill. He fell on the ground, died of his injuries. So there is still a group of people in Britain who toast each year to the gentleman in black velvet. The gentleman that dug that hole, the mole. and caused the change in the way Britain was governed. But maybe that wasn't it. Maybe it was time for somebody to sacrifice themselves for the land. And maybe this was time for somebody to sacrifice themselves to the land. And maybe that sacrifice, that giving up of life, was enough to prevent an invasion. We don't know. Steve.
So I was thinking about using this in a game and how you might go about it. And you might not play the actual people, members of the coven, but you could do. But you might be people who are trying to ensure that the ritual can happen. And so there's going to be a lot of barriers in the way for that happening. Anybody recognise this guy here?
I do now, yeah. Anyone else?
Anyone else? He lived in Lymington during the war. He was involved in British intelligence.
He wrote some awful books, which made excellent films.
It is Dennis Wheatley.
Yeah.
So he was a British intelligence officer who lived in Lymington at the time. And the British intelligence were very worried about anybody talking about the plans. So they arrested a witch.
They arrested a spiritualist.
A spiritualist.
Helen Duncan, who had, in a séance, which unfortunately was attended by a naval officer who was effectively doing some undercover detective work to find out what she was up to, she revealed that a British ship had sunk with all hands, which is not the sort of information you want to be in the public sphere, because you don't want the opposition to know that you've lost one of your warships.
And also some days before the invasion, the code names of the beaches, the landing beaches, were revealed in a crossword. So British intelligence is going to be in the area. You might even meet Dennis Wheatley. There might be German spies. I mean, German spies famously did very poorly in Britain because they were very easily detected because they would wait at their table in a pub to be served, for example, or they didn't know who'd won the FA Cup last year. But there might be German magicians who are doing counter spells, who might have sent some horrible agents across the channel to interfere. You might you need a place to do it. You need to ritually clear that place. And perhaps the other inhabitants of the New Forest, not just the moles, might have to be appeased.
Ponies?
The ponies, but also this chap over here, who's the Biston Dragon, who loves a drink of milk. And he was defeated by this knight who lured him on with the drink of milk. And then there's getting all the ritual items together. What items do you need? What corresponds to the German invasion? It's called Operation Sea Lion, but I don't suppose anybody's going to get a sea lion, are they, in the New Forest? But also, perhaps we do need an actual sacrifice. Is there anything sweeter than to lay down one's life for one's country? So there's a real moral dilemma for the group there. Who is going to lay down their life to prevent this from happening? So,
Folklore Engine.
Moving on from there, this is lovely William Blake and one of his thoughts. So, the Folklore Engine is my attempt to break down folklore into common elements. Folklorists have been doing this for a while, and there are great indices of folktales classified by elements. There's something called the Arna Thompson Uther Index, first created in 1910 by Auntie Arna. And AT310 is the Maiden in the Tower, which is better known as Rapunzel. But my schema is even more structural than this. So I have a location, I have the people who might be affected, I have the actors who are at the event, I have the event, I have the outcome of the event, and I have what the recurrence is, how we now know that this thing happened, how it's passed into folklore, what is left over. So places could be caves, forests, hills, things like that. Actors could be children, travellers, priests, virgins. And the recurrence could be a place name, an apparition, some local gossip, or perhaps even a calendar custom like the Abbots Bromley folk dance. So here's an example that I created for my game. And I just made this up on the fly as two characters. So Archie and Cassie are the two players in my game. They came to a crossroads at a point where they know two ley lines meet. And they're hoping to perform a ritual at this crossroads to activate the node and gain power from it. And it's a desolate spot in the hills, but there's an old and creaking gibbet there. And when the characters use their magical sight, they're surprised to see a man hanging from a rope and another looking at him, both in medieval garb. So Thomas, hands firmly in his breeches, explains that he is sad that his brother Jed has been hanged for killing the local lord. Thomas actually committed the crime, but can't bring himself to beg forgiveness from his brother. If he can be persuaded to do so, they can both leave the mortal realm. However, Thomas is quite stubborn, and Jed's hanging by the neck and he can't speak. Although he can if the rope is loosened. However, if you let Jed down, Thomas gets enraged and he attacks, and he pulls his hands out of his pockets, and they're actually knives, not hands anymore. So Perchance, I don't know if you know Perchance, but it's a lovely website where you can write your own generators. So I've written a generator for Folklore Engine. You can randomize this thing. You can click on individual elements and randomize them if you're not happy with them. So it's got all the elements you need to build your own myth. You can also edit it. So there's all the stuff in the background about what's going on in there. So the example here is we've got a balancing stone. So these are common in areas like Dartmoor, where there's a rocky outcrop and then there's a stone on top that erosion, or possibly something else, has eroded around the surrounding rocks, and it's just left balancing, teetering on the brink. So who's involved? We've got a leech and a cellarer. I've got a very long list of medieval occupations. So these are possibly slightly too overspecified. But anyway, a leech is some kind of medical man. A cellarer is somebody who looks after a cellar. So they were involved. A woodmonger, so somebody who was out in a nearby copse of wood, saw what was going on. That's how we know. What happened? So ghosts of the dead appear to wreak vengeance. What happened? Some kind of sin against natural law. So whatever this leech and the cellarer were doing was something terrible against natural law. Possibly the cellarer had caught some kind of horrible disease from being in the damp cellars, and the leech was curing him, but he was doing so using a spirit that lived in this rock. That's not a good thing to do. What's the consequence? A curse. So the cellarer, by accepting this evil magic from this leech, he's been cursed, but not just him, his whole line has been cursed.
And to the 8th generation, usually.
Oh, I only go to 7.
Oh, you're good.
And what now reminds us of this? Well, the rock's probably got some kind of name. Devil's Rock, it's probably called. But it might be something more focused on this curse. It might be called the Cellarer's Curse, which is a bit too on the money, maybe. I don't know. I can't think of something. If anybody's got any good ideas, shout it out. And possible myths, so things to do with ghosts. The ghost of perhaps the ghost of the leech is still around because he did this awful thing. And he's around haunting the generations of this family. And so the thing you have to do to stop the curse is find the ghost and do something appropriate for a leech to sort the curse out. So, returning. So we might have a video.
We hope.
This started more than 5 years ago. We were looking into the magical Battle of Britain when in the 1940s the New Forest Coven formed rituals to stop Operation Sea Lion, the Nazi invasion. We'd looked in the British Museum and the only thing we found was a reference to the Dingwall collection. So we went to Senate House, which is right here. Dingwall collection's in the library there. And we found some mentions of previously unknown occult groups. People we'd never heard of before, not seen written down anywhere. So there was the Esoteric Order of Albion, the Thelemic Order of the Silver Twilight, the Aegis of Oxford, Council of Lion Rampant, and Cupitorus Mystery. And it was just a handwritten list, and I'm afraid we took it. So don't let Chris, the keeper of the collection, know. And at the top of the note, it just says Oxford with a question mark. And at the bottom, it just says, Ask Darcy with a question mark.
So we'd not heard of these groups, but we'd heard of Darcy. I became very acquainted with Darcy when some papers of his were found in an attic in Clapham in London and passed to me to put into some kind of order. Darcy was an occultist who was compiling a gazetteer of magical London, but before dying in mysterious circumstances. Well, after a bit of editing by me, his papers were published as the Book of the Smoke. And references in the text show that he was either a member of an organisation called the Brotherhood, or that he'd been commissioned by them, recruited by them to put the information together. But the Brotherhood means nothing, really. I mean, many occult organisations call each other brother and sister. So after that book was published, I was contacted and told that more of his writings exist that predate the London papers. It seems that before he focused on the capital, he was doing similar work all over England, and the notes were even more jumbled. It took an awful lot of time to sift through them. He was looking for a link between all these legends, prophecies, landmarks. He seemed to think that there was some kind of connection, but whatever it was about, and I have no clue, and I've read all this stuff, he couldn't be dissuaded, and he brought in some help from a medium friend and also from his aunt, who was a spiritualist. So I couldn't draw any conclusions. I've collated the stuff, but I know he lost his job at a local paper because he was so single-minded about it that he wasn't going to work. But all of that still didn't get us any further. And there was no mention in the British Library or museums of any of the groups that Steve talked about.
So a few years later, we were in Oxford for a conference, living in a magical world, inner lives, 1300 to 1900 at St Anne's College. And this included a special preview of an accompanying exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum. And one of the exhibits was some papers from a local group, and the corners of the pages were marked in a funny script, which turned out to be Enochian, John Dee's language of the angels. And it was the initials EOA, which stands for the Esoteric Order of Albion. And another paper was marked Alpha Iota Gamma Iota Sigma, the Greek for Aegis of Oxford, which is another one of the groups we mentioned earlier. And we'd got permission to view these pages, and there was a whole mess of things. There were two pieces of William Blake, both handwritten, maybe even in his handwriting, I don't know. The first from a memorable fancy, which said, "In the first chamber was a dragon man clearing away the rubbish from a cave's mouth. Within, a number of dragons were hollowing the cave." And then there was a snippet of a poem, The Crystal Cabinet. "Another worm like herself, translucent, lovely, shining clear, threefold each in the others closed, oh what a pleasant trembling fear." But the version in the published Pickering manuscript, instead of worm, says lady. And then there's this funny piece of wood. There's a sort of a truncated star. Don't really know what that's about. And there was a bit of rambling prediction attributed to a William James Barnes, who was concerned about England and, as he said, a snake within this Eden. And it was also connected with Darcy's Brotherhood in some way. So we knew we were onto something. And finally, there was a page, a ritual from Le Dragon Rouge, a pseudo-medieval grimoire, about finding treasure. But it had been amended and included dates, astronomical data, and results, the discovery of a gold plate buried under a hill. And a note in the margin said, "Archie, I told you this would work, Cassie." We tried to find evidence of any of these people, especially James William Barnes. But when we approached the National Archives, they said initially they had no record of him. And then we found him in some war records held in the US. And the National Archives said it was a matter of national security. So that's why we're skulking around London with you, trying to keep under the radar of officialdom. We've seen a lot more material, a lot to do with William Blake, English folklore, and magic rituals.
As far as we can tell, several magical groups were active in and around Oxford between the wars, and they claim to have performed these rituals. They're engaged in work which was concerned with national security. The closer we got, the more doors were closed to us. Our British Library passes revoked, our phones were tapped. Steve's health's been affected, there's but people have a right to know about this, and so we decided to publish it as a game and get it out to people under the official radar.
Shit, I've seen that guy before. We've got to get out of here. Come on, quick! This way!
What's it called?
Fanciful Symmetry.
Fanciful Symmetries.
It's an advert for the Pelgrane Press books that we just released. Fearful Symmetry, which is my Blake English folklore magic Trail of Cthulhu campaign. And
Book of the New Jerusalem, which is my book of English folklore and weird stuff that you might want to put in your games. And it's completely not system specific. So, if you play other stuff, you can still use it. We're out of time.
Oh, we have to go.
We have to go.
Okay.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
A media production from the Innsmouth House studio.